by and large, prejudice tends to be an ascription of inferiority, right? We in the majority are the good people, the moral people, the smart people, the whatever people look at this minority in our country. They're worse than us. They're poorer and stupider and more whatever, right? And so you're saying, we need to protect our country against these inferior people. That is um, how prejudice tends to be expressed. With Jews, as you're pointing out, there's a sort of inferiority, superiority, right? On one hand, you are saying, Jews are vermin, they're scum, they're morally bad, etc. So there is a ascription of inferiority. But there's also this fear of this superiority. They secretly govern the world. They're the ones who are really in charge, right? Um, how much of that is rooted in the empirical success that Jews have had in various societies, right? Going back to what you were saying about, the Nazis and a lot of Germans blamed the Jews for being the communists who, are communist activists. And then you go to, Moscow at the same time, and the Jews are being blamed for being the capitalists.
Yeah.
And of course, in a way, both were true at the time, which is to say that if you look at the leadership of communist parties, Jews were overrepresented, and if you look at successful businessmen, Jews were overrepresented as well. And it's just because, for complicated cultural and other reasons, Jews have proven to be very successful in the modern world. In the late 19th and early 20th century, they're overrepresented, in the world of communist activists and in the world of capitalists and on Wall Street and in Hollywood and yes, in journalism. And according to some story that I never dug into, they looked up some neo-Nazi leaders, and it turned out that a surprising number of them had some Jewish roots too. So, what, how much of this is obviously a rational sort of response to the fact that Jews have been quite successful in the modern world?
Well, look, I mean, I think there's no I mean, look, I am a former entrepreneur, right? So I had the good fortune to try my hand at business, at creating new things, and it was blessed to have some success at that. And in some ways, the act of creating new things, not starting out with money, not starting out with resources, not starting out with some kind of like aristocratic pedigree. I was first in my family to go to college. I mean, it's not a big deal. It just is what it is. But like, I had to figure it out. And I think there's something very Jewish about that, because Jews typically are immigrants. Jews typically come to places historically, without land, without capital, without a pedigree. So they have to figure it out. I mean, Talmudic education, the nature, the questioning, the inquisitive nature, the questioning kind of imperative in Talmudic kind of study is about figuring it out. And so I think there is this cultural impulse for Jews who didn't lack some of the things I was just saying. They didn't have the privilege of those advantages. We have a cultural predilection to, quote, figuring it out. And so I think when you look at the overrepresentation of Jews, I mean, Jews went to communism because, yeah, I mean, look, I can't speak for all the Jews, but like across societies, not just in the former Soviet Union. Like, it's funny, my wife has family in Iran who were communists because the Jews were discriminated against because of their religion. So this idea of wiping out religion seemed like an antidote to the persistent, their persistent diminishment because they were the wrong religion. And then Jews were the capitalists because in free markets they figured it out and they could by their wits create things that otherwise wasn't available to them, and so on. So there is, I think, a survival instinct that kicks in, and Jews figure it out and have throughout time because they lacked other inherent advantages. But I also would say that, so often as the case, we lose sight of history. Like Jews historically, while we've succeeded beyond the wildest imagination of our forebears in America and in the world writ large in the year 2022, 2023, oh my God, I think 100 years ago, this kind of success was almost unimaginable. It just was. I mean, in the year 1923, I mean, Jews were living here comfortably in the US, but look, the ADL was formed just 10 years earlier, right? Because Jews had a series of systematic disadvantages, couldn't buy homes in many places in the United States, couldn't work in many professions, were kept out of medical institutions, kept out of universities, and so on and so forth. I think to think 100 years later that there'd be a Jewish second gentleman, there'd be Jewish leadership in businesses and academia and culture. I mean, this was, I don't think it could have really been, it was unimaginable. So Jews have had disproportionate success relative to our small numbers. I think part of that's fueled by the survival instinct. And yet we also should keep in mind that even though they have succeeded, they've never had the kind of success. And it certainly never came easy to them. And it was always ephemeral, right? The one thing, Yascha, that's certainly true throughout the Jewish experience, almost in every country where the Jewish people have lived, with the exceptions of like India and a few others, Canada, even pretty much in this country, Australia, like in all the places, the Jewish experience ends at some point, like literally. The story goes to, persecution, forced conversion, appropriation, and death or exile. Like, honestly, throughout Europe, throughout North Africa and the Middle East, like this, throughout sub-Saharan Africa, this is how the story ends. Just does.